Imagine this. The year is 1066. The morning sun glimmers over a small wooden bridge near the village of Stamford. On one side, thousands of English soldiers, shields, spears, and swords at the ready, press forward. On the other side stands a single man, a Viking, towering, broad-shouldered, gripping a massive battle axe in both hands. He is alone, but he does not run. He does not beg. He roars, a sound that drowns even the clash of armor, and the first wave of English soldiers rushes toward him. The bridge narrows their advance. One by one they come, and one by one they fall. According to the chronicles, this single warrior killed over 40 men alone, holding off an entire army while his comrades prepared for battle. His name is lost to history, but his legend endures. The Berserker of Stamford Bridge. But who was this man? Did he truly exist? Or was he a myth woven into the story of England's bloodiest year? Today, we'll step back into the chaos of 1066. When kings fought for crowns, Vikings made their final bid for glory, and one nameless warrior carved his place in history with an axe and an unshakable will. This is the story of the last great Viking stand, the calm before the storm. In the late summer of 1066, England was a kingdom on edge. King Harold Godwinson had only recently claimed the crown after the death of Edward the Confessor, and rivals circled like wolves. To the north, the great Viking warlord Harold Hardrada prepared to press his claim, supported by Harold's own estranged brother Tostig. Their fleets crossed the North Sea, sails like dragon wings blotting the horizon, promising blood and fire. For the English, the first whispers of invasion spread like smoke. Farmers left their fields to clutch spears, while village priests prayed against the coming storm. But no one yet knew how terrible or how heroic the clash would become. Among Hardrada's host was a man whose name history forgot but whose deeds survived in legend. A towering warrior, said to be a berserker, who would one day stand alone on a narrow bridge and make the English tremble. Before that moment, however, he was just another figure in the tide of steel and fury sweeping toward England. The Viking war machine. The Vikings who landed in northern England were no ragtag raiders. This was a full-scale invasion force, hardened by decades of conquest across Europe. Harold Hardrada had spent his youth as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, his sword carving a path from Constantinople to the deserts of the Holy Land. By the time he sailed for England, he had seen more battlefields than most men could dream or survive. His army reflected this experience. Ships carried not only warriors but also supplies, horses, and armor. Spears bristled like a forest of death. Shields gleamed with painted designs of serpents and ravens, and swords hung heavy at their sides. At the core were the berserkers, feared fighters who claimed Odin's spirit filled them with rage, so fierce they felt neither pain nor fear. Whether this was true madness, ritual drug use, or simply terrifying bravado, one thing was certain. No enemy wanted to meet them, head-on. As they marched inland, the Viking army struck swift and hard. Towns were sacked, hostages taken, and the English defenders scattered. Each step they took brought them closer to York, the heart of the north. The land groaned under their boots, but even the fiercest warriors could not foresee the moment when fate would trap one of their own on a narrow bridge, holding off an entire army. The English awakening. News of the Viking landing hit King Harold Godwinson like a thunderclap. He had been watching the southern coast, waiting for William of Normandy, but now he was forced to pivot north. Gathering his Huscarls' elite household troops, armed with massive axes and calling every able-bodied man to arms, Harold began a forced march. In just 4 days, his army covered nearly 200 miles, a feat so punishing that men collapsed by the roadside, boots soaked in blood, but the king pressed them on. The English army was a strange mix of professional warriors and common farmers, but united by desperation. They knew that if Hardrada's Vikings gained a foothold, England might never be free again. Huscarls swore oaths to stand by their king until death. The Fyrd, the local militia, clutched weapons with trembling hands, hoping courage would come when steel clashed. When Harold reached the north, he struck like lightning. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings, caught off guard after a raid, were spread out and unprepared. Yet fate had one last twist to play. For on that narrow wooden bridge spanning the Derwent River, a single Viking warrior would step forward, axe in hand, ready to carve his name into legend. The Berserker on the bridge. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle tells us that as Harold's army closed in, the Vikings scrambled to regroup. But to buy time, one warrior volunteered to hold the narrow wooden bridge that spanned the River Derwent. We do not know his name. Some later sagas simply call him a berserker, one of those half-mythical Viking warriors said to fight in a trance-like fury, immune to pain and fear. He stood there, axe in hand, as thousands of English soldiers advanced. The bridge was narrow enough that only one or two could face him at a time, and that was his advantage. The first man rushed him. With a single swing, the Viking split him down. Another came, shield raised. The axe shattered wood and bone alike. Again and again, the English tried, and again, they fell. By some accounts he killed more than 40 men before the English changed tactics. Unable to overwhelm him head-on, one soldier crept beneath the bridge, thrusting a spear upward into the Viking's body. Only then did the giant fall. One man, buying time for his people? One man, remembered 1,000 years later, year of the Three Kings? The year 1066 was no ordinary year. It was the year of three kings, a time when England became the prize in a deadly game of ambition. Edward the Confessor's death left no clear heir, and Harold Godwinson seized the crown. Too many? He was the rightful choice. Strong, experienced, a leader in war, but beyond England's shores, others saw weakness. In Normandy, Duke William readied his ships, swearing that Edward had promised the throne to him. In the north, Harold Hardrada, the greatest Viking of his age, claimed England through blood and treaties, joined by Harold's own exiled brother, Tostig. England now faced enemies on every side. Its people worked their fields with one eye on the horizon, knowing sails could appear at any moment. Armies gathered, churches prayed, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The uncertainty was palpable. Nobles whispered in castles and villages, wondering who would rise and who would fall. Fear and hope intertwined, shaping every decision. Which lord would march north? Which towns would prepare defenses? And which ordinary men would be called to fight for a crown not truly theirs? 3 claimants, 1 crown. Before the year ended, thousands would die, kingdoms would fall, and a nameless Viking standing on a wooden bridge would become part of legend, a symbol of courage in a year where the fate of a nation hung by a thread. Harold Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north. Harold Hardrada was no ordinary man. By the time he set his eyes on England, he had already lived a lifetime of war, betrayal, and glory. Born into the royal house of Norway, he had fled as a young man after a failed bid for the throne, wandering east to the courts of Constantinople. There, he became a member of the elite Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, and fought in lands where the sun scorched deserts and glittered off marble palaces. Hardrada's experience was unmatched. He had faced Byzantine armies, Arab mercenaries, and the treacheries of his own countrymen. Every battle honed him, every campaign strengthened his resolve. By the time he returned to Norway to claim his throne, he was no longer just a prince. He was a warrior whose name inspired both fear and respect across Europe. But Harold was not content with a single kingdom. He was driven by ambition and a hunger for conquest. England, with its rich fields, strategic ports, and divided nobility, seemed the perfect prize. He believed the throne was his by right, a legacy promised through treaties and familial claims. And so he gathered his fleet, thousands of warriors at his back, ships cutting across the North Sea like blades of iron, heading south to claim the crown that awaited him. Every man in his army was battle-hardened, every ship stocked for both siege and slaughter. Among them were berserkers, warriors said to be possessed by Odin's spirit, capable of frenzy and fearless in combat. Harold Hardrada was the hammer, his army, the storm. Together, they would descend upon England like a tide of death, unaware that the year itself had more twists to throw at them than they could imagine. Tostig, Godwinson, brother, traitor, outcast. Harold Hardrada did not march alone. At his side was Tostig Godwinson, once a powerful Earl of Northumbria, now an exiled man burning with vengeance, cast out by his own people and resented even by his brother Harold. Tostig's ambition and bitterness fueled the Viking invasion in ways that went beyond ordinary strategy. Tostig's knowledge of English lands, roads, and weak points made him invaluable to Hardrada. He guided the fleet up rivers, advised on towns to pillage, and whispered strategies that could cripple the English defenses, before Harold even had a chance to respond. But his presence also added a deeply personal element to the conflict. This was not only a war for crowns, but a war of family, betrayal, and pride. For the English, Tostig's betrayal was unimaginable. Men who had once sworn loyalty to him now faced his armies, knowing that the guidance of a former noble had sharpened the swords against them. And yet, Tostig's rage was not solely about revenge. It was about reclaiming status, proving himself a man wronged by fate and family alike, willing to throw his homeland into chaos to satisfy his pride. The combination of Hardrada's experience and Tostig's intimate knowledge of England created a force that seemed unstoppable. Together, they were both thunder and arrow, crashing down on the north with speed and precision that caught many unprepared, setting the stage for one of the most famous confrontations in medieval history, the Battle of Before Stamford Bridge, the Vikings tested the might of England at Fulford, near York. Hardrada and Tostig had landed in the north, and the local Earls, Edwin and Mercar, gathered their forces to meet them. What unfolded was not just a battle, but a preview of the devastation to come. The Vikings struck with the ferocity of men who had nothing to lose. Shields clashed, spears shattered, and the English formations were slowly torn apart. Hardrada's men used both cunning and brute force. Archers rained arrows into tight ranks, while berserkers charged with a fury that defied reason. Within hours, the northern earls were routed, their forces scattered, their morale crushed. For Harold Godwinson, hearing of the defeat was a call to immediate action. England could not withstand a Viking foothold in the north, and he could not let the invaders consolidate power. Fulford was a warning. Hardrada was not merely raiding. He was here to claim the crown, and only rapid, decisive action could stop him. The battle also revealed the Vikings' strategic genius. They moved like water, filling gaps in the lines, exploiting terrain, and using the element of surprise. Every victory hardened Hardrada's reputation and emboldened his men, setting the stage for a confrontation that would see England's greatest warrior face one of history's most terrifying invaders. The forced march. Harold Godwinson responded with urgency that became legendary. From London to York, his army covered nearly 200 miles in 4 days, an almost impossible feat for men carrying axes, shields, and armor. Soldiers marched through mud, rain, and exhaustion, yet the king drove them onward, understanding that speed was the only chance to intercept Hardrada before he could entrench. The march was brutal. Horses stumbled, men fell by the wayside, blisters and fatigue turned every step into agony. Yet Harold's leadership was unwavering. He motivated his troops with promises of glory and survival, turning exhaustion into resolve. Each night, campfires flickered not just with warmth, but with determination. Every dawn became another step closer to destiny. By the time Harold's army reached the north, the English soldiers were battle-ready despite their exhaustion. The forced march exemplified medieval endurance and discipline, showing that victory was as much about speed, stamina, and morale, as it was about strength in battle. The stand at Stamford Bridge, the stage was set. On the wooden bridge spanning the River Derwent, the nameless Viking warrior awaited. The bridge was narrow, no more than a few feet wide, the perfect choke point for one man to hold back a host. Thousands of English soldiers pressed forward, but only 2 could confront him at a time. Chronicles tell of a fearsome battle. The Viking swung his massive axe with precision, his strength and skill unmatched. Men fell before him, shields splintered, swords shattered. The English tried to overwhelm him, but the narrow bridge favored the defender. Wave after wave, he held them at bay, a living wall of steel and fury. Eventually, the English found a way. A soldier crept beneath the bridge, thrusting a spear upward. The Viking fell, ending his stand. Yet in his death he became immortal, a symbol of courage against impossible odds. Remembered for over 9 centuries. The Viking defeat. With the bridge taken, the English pressed forward. The rest of Hardrada's army, spread thin and unprepared, could not resist. Chaos erupted. Shields were overturned, formations collapsed, and the Vikings who had stormed northern England found themselves overrun. Harold Hardrada fell in battle, struck down by Harold's men. Tostig also died. His ambitions ended in blood and dust. What had seemed an unstoppable invasion force was broken within hours, leaving England victorious but battered. The defeat marked the effective end of the Viking era in England. Large-scale Norse invasions ceased, and the age of raiding and conquest gave way to diplomacy, trade, and assimilation. Yet the memory of Stamford Bridge, and the lone warrior who held a bridge against an army, lived on in sagas and chronicles. Berserkers, myth, madness, and reality. The Viking on the bridge was called a berserker, a term that has fascinated historians for centuries. Were these men possessed by Odin, fueled by drugs or ritual trance, or simply fearless warriors conditioned for battle? Berserkers were said to fight without armor, roar like beasts, and shrugged off pain. They terrified foes and inspired comrades, becoming living legends and sagas. Some modern historians argue that they were psychologically trained, using adrenaline and ritual to enhance aggression. Others suggest hallucinogens or extreme meditation may have been involved. What is clear is that the bridge warrior embodied this mythic status, a man who combined skill, strength, and sheer audacity to perform a feat few could imagine. In life, he bought time. In legend, he bought immortality. Fact versus legend. Stamford Bridge is remembered as much for the stories it inspired as for the battle itself. The image of a lone Viking holding a bridge against dozens of men has echoed through history, becoming larger than life. Yet historians have long debated how much of it is fact and how much is legend. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated events to convey heroism or warn of dangers. Numbers were inflated, feats amplified, and enemies sometimes transformed into giants or supernatural figures. The unnamed Viking, said to have killed more than 40 men, may have been a skilled fighter, but the exact count is uncertain. Even so, the story captures the essence of human courage and strategy. Narrow terrain, skillful defense, and sheer audacity could allow a single warrior to delay an army. The psychological impact of such a figure cannot be measured in numbers alone. Legends like this reveal what people valued: bravery, honor, and the idea that one person could shape events. The story endured because it resonated, symbolizing resistance against overwhelming odds. Even if the details were exaggerated, the core truth of the bridge warrior's stand remains compelling. Over time, storytellers added layers to the narrative. Sagas depicted him as a giant, Norse poets framed him as divinely favored, and English chroniclers emphasized the terror he inspired. Fact and legend intertwined, creating a tale that survived for centuries. Aftermath of Stamford Bridge. With the bridge finally taken, the English army pressed forward. Hardrada's forces, spread thin and unprepared, could not resist. Chaos spread among the Vikings as formations collapsed and soldiers fled. Harold Hardrada lay dead, Tostig along with him, and the invasion that had threatened northern England ended abruptly. The victory solidified Harold Godwinson's reputation as a decisive and capable leader, yet it came at a cost. His army was exhausted from the forced march and previous battles. The battle marked the effective end of large-scale Viking invasions in England. Survivors returned home carrying stories of bravery, cunning, and the single warrior who had held the bridge. For England, the immediate threat from the north was gone, but the kingdom remained on edge. Harold would soon face another challenge, one that would demand every ounce of strength, strategy, and endurance he had left. Stamford Bridge, though a victory, was only a chapter in a year defined by war, ambition, and shifting fates. Its lessons were clear. Even the greatest triumphs could set the stage for new trials. The Norman threat in Hastings. No sooner had Harold celebrated victory in the north than news arrived from the south. William of Normandy had gathered a fleet, intent on pressing his claim to the English crown. Harold's men, weary from their march and battle, had little time to recover. The king marched his army south, moving as quickly as possible to meet the threat. The journey was grueling. Soldiers marched through mud and rain, their bodies aching, yet morale remained high. Harold understood that speed was critical. Any delay could allow William to gain a strategic advantage. When the armies met at Hastings, the English faced Norman cavalry, archers, and combined assault tactics unlike anything they had encountered in the north. The battle was brutal and decisive, a clash that would determine the future of England. Stamford Bridge had drained Harold's resources, but it had also tested his leadership and hardened his troops. Every lesson from the north would now be put to the ultimate test. The events of 1066 reveal how triumph and tragedy are intertwined. Even a great victory could sow the seeds for new challenges, and England's fate hung precariously on the decisions of its king and the valor of his warriors. The end of the Viking Age. Stamford Bridge is often regarded as the final great Viking attempt to conquer England. For centuries, Norsemen had raided and settled along the coasts, but 1066 marked the end of their large-scale invasions. The Vikings' boldest ambitions were curtailed. Survivors integrated into local communities, turning from raiders into traders and settlers. The era of terror that had defined the Viking presence in England gradually faded. The bridge warrior stands as the emblem of this transition, a final figure of raw, unrestrained force, whose courage symbolized a fading age. Though the Norse legacy persisted in culture, language, and settlements, the era of conquest had ended. Stamford Bridge reminds us that even unstoppable forces can meet limits. The Vikings' military brilliance could not overcome exhaustion, strategy, and the resolve of defenders. Yet their legend continued to inspire tales of bravery, honor, and defiance. The battle also demonstrated the interplay between history and myth, as extraordinary feats became immortalized and served as cautionary and inspirational tales for generations to come. Legendary retellings and sagas. Stories of Stamford Bridge lived far beyond the battlefield. Norse sagas celebrated the courage of warriors, while English chronicles highlighted triumph and strategy. Each retelling added drama, amplifying feats and emotions. The nameless Viking became a symbol of heroism, a figure larger than life. Some accounts portrayed him as a giant, others as a man touched by divine favor. Regardless, the image endured, inspiring generations of storytellers. Medieval poets and historians used the tale to teach lessons of courage, loyalty, and skill. Even modern retellings in literature, games, and media draw on the drama of the bridge, blending history with myth to create enduring narratives. The endurance of these stories shows the power of legend to shape cultural memory. They remind us that the deeds of a single individual can echo across centuries, influencing how societies remember bravery and heroism. Stamford Bridge became more than a battle. It became a story, a saga, that connected past and present, history and imagination. Last stands in history. Stamford Bridge fits into the broader history of last stands. Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rongsvow Pass. These moments captivate because they combine courage, desperation, and skill against overwhelming odds. The lone Viking embodies this archetype. Against a narrow bridge and countless enemies, he delayed an army, exemplifying how one person's actions can shape events far beyond their immediate presence. Such stands inspire because they highlight human determination. They show that courage, timing, and skill can alter the flow of history, even if the eventual outcome is defeat or death. History remembers not just victories, but the bravery to face impossible odds. Stamford Bridge serves as a timeless reminder that heroism can take many forms, and that a single figure, even nameless, can leave an indelible mark on history, legacy, and lessons. The legacy of Stamford Bridge extends far beyond the battlefield. Harold's leadership, Hardrada's ambition, Tostig's betrayal, and the bridge warrior's courage combined to shape history in ways still felt today. The battle teaches lessons about strategy, endurance, and the human spirit. Triumph and tragedy often coexist. Victories may be hard-won, and great feats can precede even greater challenges. For modern audiences, the story resonates because it captures timeless themes: courage, sacrifice, and the impact of individual action. One man on a bridge delayed an army, yet his stand transcended numbers, becoming a symbol of heroism. From the wooden bridge to the halls of kings, the echoes of 1066 remind us that history is shaped by choices, skill, and bravery. Legends endure not because they are flawless, but because they inspire, challenge, and endure in human memory. The Viking Berserker culture. The Vikings were more than raiders. They were shaped by a culture that revered strength, courage, and honor above all. Berserkers, the fiercest among them, embodied these ideals. They were said to fight in frenzies, immune to pain, striking terror into the hearts of enemies. Some believed they were possessed by Odin's spirit, others that ritual, herbs, or sheer will induced their legendary rage. Berserkers trained from youth, mastering weapons, endurance, and battlefield tactics. They were the shock troops of Norse armies, used to break enemy lines or guard vital points. Yet their role was as psychological as it was physical. A single berserker could demoralize hundreds with appearance, roar, and reckless ferocity. The bridge warrior at Stamford Bridge exemplifies this culture. He used both skill and psychological advantage, holding a narrow choke point where his rage and prowess magnified his impact. His stand was not merely brute strength. It reflected centuries of martial tradition, belief in honor, and the strategic use of fear. Beyond battle, berserkers held a complex place in Viking society. They were respected, feared, and sometimes ostracized. Their presence in tales and sagas transformed real warriors into symbols of unyielding courage, blurring the line between history and legend. In essence, to understand the lone Viking on the bridge is to understand the mindset that drove the Viking people: ambition tempered by loyalty, ferocity tempered by strategy, and bravery celebrated as the highest virtue. Weapons and tactics at Stamford Bridge. The weapons used at Stamford Bridge were as decisive as the warriors themselves. Axes, swords, spears, and shields formed the backbone of both Viking and English armies. The bridge's narrowness amplified their effect. Heavy axes could cleave shields, and spears thrust through gaps could kill or disable an enemy in a single strike. Harold's Huscarls, armed with massive two-handed axes, met the Vikings with disciplined formations, their shields locked, spears braced, and axes ready to counter every attack. For a few moments, the bridge became a crucible of technique and instinct, where each swing and parry determined life or death. The Vikings, by contrast, relied on aggression, ferocity, and the sheer unpredictability of their berserkers. Their formations were looser, but their strikes were sudden and brutal. The combination of trained English soldiers and wild, unpredictable Norse fighters created clashes that were chaotic yet mesmerizing. Terrain played a critical role. The narrow wooden bridge limited the number of combatants who could engage at once. It magnified the power of a single defender, allowing the bridge warrior to delay entire waves of soldiers. This strategic choke point turned individual skill into a force multiplier. Understanding these weapons and tactics illuminates the extraordinary challenge of Stamford Bridge. It was not merely a battle of numbers. It was a clash of cultures, training, and strategy, where geography and human skill intertwined to shape history. The English among Harold Godwinson's forces were the Huscarls, elite household warriors who stood at the very core of his army. Trained from youth and bound by oath to their king, they fought with discipline and loyalty few could match. Armed with great two-handed axes, they were devastating in close combat, capable of cleaving both man and shield in a single blow. The Huscarls represented the professional backbone of Harold's army. Unlike the local fyrd militia, these men were full-time warriors, hardened by years of service. Their presence on the battlefield gave Harold both confidence and an invaluable edge in strategy. Their discipline allowed them to form tight shield walls, a tactic that had served the English well for generations. At Stamford Bridge, these warriors marched alongside farmers and villagers called into service. The contrast was stark. Trained professionals standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had never faced organized battle. Yet in the crucible of war, their unity held. The lone Viking warrior, standing against Harold's army, would have faced these very Huscarls. Their training, experience, and equipment made them formidable, but even they could be delayed on the narrow bridge. This highlights not only the Vikings' courage but the unique circumstances that allowed one man to resist such seasoned fighters. The Huscarls' loyalty to Harold extended beyond Stamford Bridge. Days later, at Hastings, they would once again stand at his side, fighting to the death in defense of their king. Their story is intertwined with the fate of England, but at Stamford Bridge, they stood as witnesses to the defiance of a single man who dared hold them back. The role of the fyrd. Beyond the Huscarls, Harold's army was filled with men of the fyrd, local militias drawn from towns and villages. These men were not professional soldiers but farmers, craftsmen, and tradesmen called upon in times of need. Each was required by duty to serve the king, often providing his own weapon, shield, and food for the campaign. Though less experienced than the Huscarls, the fyrd brought numbers and determination. Many fought not for glory, but for survival, knowing that defeat meant their homes and families would be at the mercy of invaders. Fear and desperation sharpened their resolve, even if their skills fell short of professional warriors. At Stamford Bridge, the Fyrd fought alongside the Huscarls, forming the bulk of Harold's army. They saw firsthand the terrifying spectacle of the lone Viking cutting men down on the narrow bridge. For many, it was likely their first taste of true battle, and such an image would remain etched in memory for life. The presence of the Fyrd reveals the collective nature of Anglo-Saxon defense. England relied not only on its kings and nobles, but on ordinary men willing to fight when duty demanded. Their courage, though often overshadowed by the exploits of elites, was vital in securing victory that day. In this way, the battle was as much a story of common men as it was of kings and warriors. The lone Vikings' defiance met not only trained soldiers but also farmers and villagers, men who fought for hearth and home against a legend in the making. The geography of Stamford Bridge. The battlefield itself played a decisive role in shaping events. Stamford Bridge, a modest wooden structure spanning the River Derwent, became the stage for one of history's most dramatic last stands. Its narrow planks transformed the fight, forcing soldiers to cross in single file or pairs. For the lone Viking, this geography was his greatest ally. The bridge neutralized the English army's numerical superiority, reducing the fight to a series of duels rather than a massed assault. Each man who stepped forward faced him on equal terms, only to be cut down by axe or thrust aside into the river below. The surrounding terrain added to the drama. Fields stretched out on both sides, dotted with villages, while the river glistened under the September sun. For the English soldiers, the crossing was a bottleneck, delaying their advance and buying precious minutes for the Viking army to regroup. Geography has often shaped battles, and Stamford Bridge is no exception. Like Thermopylae centuries earlier, a narrow pass allowed a small force to resist overwhelming numbers. The Viking warrior's defiance was magnified by the environment, turning an ordinary crossing into a place of legend. Even centuries later, the setting remains unchanged in imagination. The wooden planks, the flowing river, and the figure of one man with an axe continue to define how the battle is remembered, a reminder of how landscapes can forge legends. Psychological warfare, beyond weapons and terrain. Psychology played a critical role in the events at Stamford Bridge. The sight of one warrior holding off wave after wave of soldiers would have shaken the English army. Fear spread easily in medieval battle, and courage could falter when men saw comrades fall before an unstoppable figure. The Viking's roar, his towering frame, and the brutality of his axe strikes created an aura of invincibility. Each fallen Englishman added to his legend in real time, making others hesitate before stepping forward. In this way, he fought not just with steel but with fear itself. For Harold's men, overcoming this psychological barrier was as important as breaking through the physical defense. Soldiers would have whispered about the warrior's strength, some perhaps believing he was blessed or cursed by gods. Such beliefs weighed heavily in an age where the supernatural was never far from thought. Ultimately, it was cunning, not courage alone, that ended his stand. An English soldier's decision to crawl beneath the bridge and strike upward with a spear was a triumph of strategy over spectacle. Yet even in defeat, the warrior's psychological impact endured, his presence shaping how the battle was remembered. This blend of fear, awe, and respect explains why the story survived. It was not just about the bodies he felled, but about the aura he created, a force as powerful as any weapon. The death of Harold Hardrada. While the lone Viking fought on the bridge, his king faced his own fate. Harold Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, was struck down during the chaos of the battle. Accounts differ on the exact moment, but most agree he was pierced through the throat by an arrow. His death marked not only the loss of a leader but the collapse of Viking hopes in England. Hardrada had spent a lifetime as a warrior, from the battlefields of Byzantium to the icy fjords of Norway, and his ambition had driven him across the sea in search of one last crown. To fall at Stamford Bridge was a bitter end, though one befitting a man who lived by the sword. His army, already reeling from the English assault, faltered with the death of their king. Morale crumbled, and the cohesion that had defined Viking warbands dissolved into desperation. Without Hardrada's presence, the will to fight evaporated, yet in death, his legend only grew. Sagas portrayed him as a towering figure, fierce to the last, his fall marking the twilight of an age. Like the lone warrior on the bridge, his story endured not because of victory, but because of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Hardrada's death, coupled with the bridge warrior's last stand, transformed Stamford Bridge from a battle into a saga. It became the moment when two legends, King and Berserker, met their end, sealing the fate of the Viking dream in England. Tostig's betrayal and fall. Fighting alongside Hardrada was Tostig Godwinson, brother of Harold, King of England. Once an English earl, Tostig had turned traitor, joining the Viking cause in hopes of reclaiming power. His decision revealed the divisions within England's ruling class, divisions that enemies eagerly exploited. Tostig's betrayal cut deep. For Harold, it meant that the battle was not only against foreign invaders, but against his own blood. The clash at Stamford Bridge carried a personal weight, turning the battlefield into a place where family loyalty gave way to ambition and vengeance. Tostig fought fiercely, but his fate mirrored that of Hardrada. He fell in the chaos, his rebellion extinguished in blood. For Harold, the victory was bittersweet. The death of a brother could not be celebrated, even if it removed a rival. Chroniclers later used Tostig's story as a warning about ambition and disloyalty. His fall showed how the lust for power could destroy even the strongest family ties. In siding with Hardrada, he gambled everything and lost his name forever tied to treachery. In the shadow of the bridge warriors' stand, Tostig's betrayal added another layer to the battle. It was not only a clash of armies, but a struggle within families, kingdoms, and loyalties. A reminder that the greatest wounds in history often come from within. The English victory. With the death of Hardrada and Tostig, and the fall of the bridge defender, the tide turned decisively. Harold's army swept across the battlefield, cutting down the remaining Vikings who fought without order or hope. Those who survived fled toward their ships, but few made it home. The scale of the victory was immense. Chroniclers claim that of the hundreds of Viking ships that arrived, barely 24 were needed to carry the survivors back across the sea. The once mighty army was shattered, its dreams of conquest drowned in the blood of Stamford Bridge. For Harold, the triumph was monumental. He had eliminated one of the greatest threats to his throne, defeating both a legendary king and his own rebellious brother. His men had proven their discipline, endurance, and loyalty in one of the hardest campaigns of the age. Yet victory carried a heavy cost. The English army was battered, exhausted, and far from rested. Their triumph at Stamford Bridge would soon be overshadowed by a greater challenge looming in the south. Still, in that moment, the field belonged to Harold. Stamford Bridge stood as one of his finest hours, a testament to leadership, courage, and the unbreakable will of an army united in purpose. The shadow of Hastings. Barely had Harold savored his triumph when news arrived of a second invasion. William of Normandy had landed in the south, bringing knights, archers, and cavalry, unlike anything England had yet faced. The Norman threat was immediate, and Harold had no choice but to march once more. The forced march north and the grueling battle at Stamford Bridge had drained the English. Men were weary, supplies scarce, and wounds fresh. Yet Harold knew delay meant disaster. William was fortifying his position and gathering support. The king led his army south in a desperate bid to confront this new danger. The march was relentless, pressing his soldiers beyond endurance. Every mile brought them closer to the clash that would decide the fate of England itself. At Hastings, Harold's army would meet its final test. The lessons of Stamford Bridge, courage, unity, and endurance, would be needed once more. But this time, the foe was not unarmored and unprepared. It was a disciplined, mounted force led by a cunning commander. The shadow of Hastings loomed over the victory at Stamford Bridge, turning triumph into a prelude for tragedy. The fate of England balanced on a knife's edge, and Harold would soon discover that even the greatest victories can carry hidden costs. The last great Viking battle. Stamford Bridge stands in history as the last great Viking battle in England. For centuries, Norse raiders and warriors had shaped the fate of the land. But 1066 marked the end of their era of conquest. Never again would a Viking king attempt such an invasion. The battle symbolized the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The Viking age of raids and expansion gave way to a new era of kingdoms, consolidation, and the rise of centralized powers like Normandy. The lone warrior on the bridge embodied the final spark of a fading age. The cultural memory of the Vikings, however, endured. Their language, settlements, and traditions remained woven into English life. Place names, legal customs, and folklore all bore traces of Norse influence, ensuring their legacy lived on even after their power waned. For Scandinavia, the defeat was equally transformative. The dream of conquering distant thrones faded. Replaced by internal struggles and the slow shift toward Christianity and European statehood, the Berserker's roar at Stamford Bridge was the last echo of the old way. Thus, Stamford Bridge was not merely a battle, but a turning point in history. It marked the sunset of the Viking Age and the dawn of a new medieval world, where the memory of one man's stand would outlive the armies that clashed around him. Aftermath of the battle. The battlefield at Stamford Bridge was a scene of ruin. Bodies lay scattered across the field, men and horses alike, while the wooden bridge itself was stained with blood. Survivors stumbled away in silence, the weight of loss pressing heavier than their weapons. The cries of the wounded mingled with the silence of the fallen, a haunting reminder of the cost of glory. For the English, the victory was bittersweet. They had secured their land against one of the greatest threats of the age, yet the price was staggering. Huscarls and levies alike had perished, and the king's forces were left diminished on the eve of a far greater challenge. Harold could not linger to honor the dead. Duty pulled him southward. The Vikings who survived faced a long and humiliating journey home. Where once a fleet of hundreds of ships had carried warriors across the sea, now only a handful remained to bear the broken remnants of Hardrada's army. Each oar stroke back to Norway carried with it the memory of defeat. To the people of England, the victory was celebrated, but it was also tempered with dread. News of William's landing spread quickly, and the joy of triumph turned to unease. The shadow of another war loomed, promising more blood before peace could be restored. In this fragile moment, the legend of the lone warrior began to take shape. Among the carnage, his stand became the tale that men carried home, retold in halls and villages, immortalizing one man against an army. The march to Hastings. No sooner had Harold's men caught their breath than the call to march again was sounded. Word of William's invasion demanded urgency, and the king could not afford delay. His weary soldiers tightened their belts, shouldered their weapons, and set out on the long road south. The march was relentless. Days blurred together as men trudged through mud, forests, and open fields, their bodies battered, but their loyalty unshaken. The speed of the movement astonished chroniclers. Harold drove his men as though time itself were his enemy, yet exhaustion took its toll. Feet blistered, wounds reopened, and hunger gnawed at bellies. Still, the king pressed on, aware that every hour lost gave William more time to fortify his position. To falter was to surrender the kingdom itself. For the soldiers, the march became a test of spirit as much as strength. Songs and prayers carried them forward, while the memory of their victory at Stamford Bridge kept them from despair. Each step southward carried the weight of England's fate. Thus, the road from Stamford to Hastings became as legendary as the battles themselves, a journey of endurance that only the most loyal and determined could complete. The Norman invasion. While the English marched, William of Normandy solidified his position. His fleet had crossed the Channel unopposed, bringing cavalry, archers, and infantry in a display of organization unmatched by his rivals. His landing at Pevensey marked the beginning of a new era. The Normans brought with them a different kind of warfare. Unlike the shield walls and axes of the English and Vikings, William's army relied on mounted knights and disciplined archery. Their tactics were modern, their armor superior, and their discipline unyielding. William wasted no time. Fortifications were raised, supply lines secured, and scouts spread across the countryside. His intent was clear. He had come not as a raider but as a conqueror. England was to be his prize, and he would not leave without it. For the English, this new enemy represented an unfamiliar challenge. Never before had they faced such a coordinated force on their own soil. The lessons of Stamford Bridge would be tested again, but the foe was unlike the Norsemen they had defeated. The Norman invasion shifted the balance of power in Europe. What began as one man's ambition would alter the course of kingdoms, setting the stage for Hastings. The battle that would decide the destiny of England. Harold's burden. Harold Godwinson carried a weight heavier than any armor. Within weeks he had faced 2 invasions, fought one of the fiercest battles in English history, and now marched his army toward yet another clash. Every decision he made bore the burden of a kingdom's survival. He was not a man of hesitation. At Stamford Bridge, his leadership had proven decisive, and his soldiers trusted him implicitly. Yet even the strongest resolve could not erase the toll of exhaustion, nor could it erase the grief of seeing his brother Tostig fall. In the quiet of the march, Harold must have reflected on the choices that had led to this moment. Could he have delayed? Could he have avoided battle until his men recovered? Each question gnawed at him, but there was no time for doubt. The king's burden was not only military, but moral. He carried the hopes of his people, the honor of his crown, and the memory of victories and losses alike. His march to Hastings was not merely a campaign. It was the weight of England's destiny resting on his shoulders. In this burden lay both greatness and tragedy. Harold's resolve would inspire his men, but it would also drive them into the jaws of fate at Hastings. The bridge, in memory. Even as Harold pressed southward, tales of the bridge warrior spread across England and beyond. In taverns, halls, and villages, men spoke of the lone Viking who held the crossing, defying an army until treachery brought him down. His defiance became a legend almost overnight. For the English, the story symbolized the ferocity of their enemies. For the Norse, it was a tale of honor, courage, and the spirit of the Berserker. Each retelling added new details. Some claimed he fought with 2 axes, others that he laughed as arrows struck his shield. The truth mattered less than the legend. What endured was the idea of one man standing alone, embodying the Viking spirit in its purest form. His death was tragic, but his legacy immortalized. In time, the tale became woven into the sagas, a reminder of the twilight of the Viking age. His name may be lost, but his story became larger than any identity could contain. He was every berserker, every warrior, every man who chose defiance over surrender. Thus, long after the armies marched away, the bridge remained, not of wood, but of memory, carrying his story across the centuries. The calm before Hastings. As Harold's army approached the southern coast, a tense silence settled over the land. Villagers fled their homes, leaving empty cottages in their wake, while scouts brought word of Norman patrols spreading like shadows. The English soldiers, weary but resolute, knew they were marching toward another reckoning. Each step carried the weight of uncertainty, yet no one spoke of retreat. For Harold, the pressure was immense. His men were tired, his forces diminished, yet he could not allow William to consolidate his power. Delay meant weakness, and weakness invited defeat. He gathered his commanders, speaking with a confidence that disguised the exhaustion beneath his armor. To his men, he was unyielding, the same king who had crushed Hardrada only weeks before. Around the campfires, whispers of fate stirred. Some believed the gods had turned their eyes upon England, testing her strength in fire and blood. Others placed their faith in Christ, praying for deliverance from the foreign threats. Whatever their belief, each soldier steeled himself for the battle to come. The landscape around Hastings became a stage upon which destiny would unfold. Fields, hills, and woodland would soon echo with the clash of swords and the cries of the dying. In this fragile pause before the storm, Harold and his men stood on the edge of history, unknowing whether glory or ruin awaited them. The calm could not last. The Normans waited, confident and prepared, while the English marched into the jaws of a battle that would reshape the very soul of England. William's resolve. While Harold pushed his men southward, William strengthened his hold on Sussex. The Norman Duke was no mere opportunist. He was a master of preparation. His fortifications at Hastings grew daily, and his supply lines stretched back across the Channel, feeding his army like veins carrying lifeblood. He had come to conquer, not to raid. William's men shared his confidence. Cavalry horses, armored knights, and disciplined archers created an army unlike anything England had faced before. Their drills echoed through the fields, a relentless rhythm that promised destruction for any who dared oppose them. To the Normans, the campaign was not a gamble, but a crusade for legitimacy. The Duke himself was relentless in spirit. His claim to the throne was framed not merely as ambition but as justice, a promise allegedly made to him by Edward the Confessor. To William, Harold was a usurper, and the sword was the only path to truth. His certainty inspired loyalty, binding his men to his cause. Around him, banners of Normandy fluttered in the wind, each marked with symbols of faith and war. Priests blessed the soldiers, framing their mission as divinely sanctioned. With both God and ambition on his side, William exuded an aura of inevitability that few dared question. Yet beneath his armor, William must have known the risk. If he failed, he would not return to Normandy a duke, but perish in foreign soil, remembered only as a man who dared too much. His resolve burned all the brighter because failure was unthinkable. The English shield wall. On the morning of October 14th, Harold's army formed its line upon Senlac Hill. It was a position chosen with care, granting the English the high ground and forcing the Normans to fight uphill. At the heart of this formation was the shield wall, a tactic as old as the Norse sagas themselves. Shields overlapped like scales of iron, creating an impenetrable barrier. Behind them, spears and axes waited, ready to strike at any who drew near. The Huscarolds, Harold's most trusted warriors, stood at the center, their great axes gleaming in the rising sun. Around them gathered the ferd, farmers, and townsmen who had left their plows to defend their land. The shield wall was more than a tactic. It was a symbol of unity. Each man depended on the one beside him, for a single gap could spell disaster. Discipline, courage, and endurance held the wall together, and Harold trusted it above all else. From his position atop the hill, the king gazed down at the Norman host, gathering below. His men were weary, but their spirits were high, bolstered by the memory of Stamford Bridge. They had defeated one invader, now they would defeat another, or so they believed. As the banners of Wessex and England unfurled in the wind, the shield wall stood as a living fortress, the last barrier between William and the crown of England. The Norman advance. When the Normans advanced, it was with precision and confidence. Trumpets blared, drums beat, and the ordered ranks moved forward like a tide of steel. Cavalry pawed the ground, archers knocked their arrows, and infantry marched in rhythm. The field at Hastings had become a stage for destruction. The first arrows darkened the sky, raining upon the English line. Shields rose, wood splintered, and men cried out, but the shield wall held firm. The Normans pressed closer, their infantry charging uphill in tight formation, yet the slope worked against them, slowing their climb and draining their strength. The English responded with fury. Spears thrust downward, axes cleaved, helmets and stones hurled from above struck deadly blows. The shield wall absorbed the impact and hurled it back, as though the hill itself fought alongside Harold's men. Knights charged, their lances lowered, but the incline robbed them of speed. Horses crashed against the shields, unseating riders and breaking lines. Yet still the wall did not break. Wave after wave of Norman might crashed against English resolve, and each time the wall stood tall. But William was no ordinary commander. He adapted swiftly, and his mind searched for cracks in Harold's defense. The first clash had proven the shield wall's strength. Now he would test its endurance. Turning the tide, the battle raged for hours, and the sun climbed higher as blood soaked the fields of Hastings. Both armies fought with unyielding determination, neither willing to concede. Yet as time passed, exhaustion gnawed at the English ranks. For every Norman that fell, another seemed to rise, while Harold's men grew fewer with each assault. William employed cunning as well as strength. Feigned retreats lured portions of the English line into pursuit, breaking the unity of the shield wall. What had been an unbreakable barrier now sprouted gaps, and the Normans were quick to exploit them. Cavalry swept through openings, striking the English from the sides and behind. Arrows continued to rain, wearing down the defenders' shields and striking exposed flesh. The once solid wall now strained under pressure, it could not withstand forever. Still, Harold's Huscarls fought with unmatched ferocity. Their axes carved through men and horses alike, each swing a final act of defiance. They bought their king precious moments, but moments could not stop the tide of an army that fought with both discipline and desperation. As the afternoon waned, the fate of England trembled on a knife's edge. The shield wall had held for much of the day, but cracks had begun to spread, and William's relentless will promised that the end was drawing near. Harold's last stand. As the Norman assaults grew fiercer, Harold remained at the heart of his army. His banner, the Golden Dragon of Wessex, flew high above the shield wall, a beacon of defiance that rallied his men. Every soldier could see their king fighting beside them, not from the rear, but shoulder to shoulder, axe in hand. His presence inspired courage where exhaustion threatened to break their resolve. The shield wall wavered but did not shatter. Huscarls locked shields tighter, their muscles straining as wave after wave of Norman attacks struck like the sea against a cliff. Farmers and townsmen, though weary, clung to their posts, drawing strength from Harold's unyielding spirit. They knew their king would not abandon them, and so they refused to abandon him. The clash became personal. Knights fell to axe blows, archers dropped with arrows still knocked, and Englishmen collapsed with shields splintered at their sides. Each life lost carved away at the shield wall's strength, but the line endured. For every gap created, Harold's voice urged men forward to close it. Around him, the noise of battle roared like thunder. The clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless pounding of hooves filled the air. Yet Harold stood calm amid the chaos, his resolve unbroken. To his men, he was not merely a king but the embodiment of England's will. It was here, in the blood-soaked earth of Hastings, that Harold carved his legacy. His stand against William was more than a fight for a crown. It was a defense of a nation's spirit, one final act of defiance against the tide of change sweeping across England. The arrow in the eye. As the sun dipped lower, the course of the battle shifted. Arrows flew in great volleys, arcing high into the sky, before plunging down upon the English ranks. Shields rose to meet them, but fatigue dulled reflexes, and gaps appeared where none had before. It was in this storm of missiles that fate struck Harold. According to chroniclers, an arrow found its mark in the king's eye. He staggered but did not fall immediately, his hand clutching the shaft as blood obscured his vision. Around him, his Huscarls closed in, desperate to shield him from the Norman advance. Their loyalty burned bright, even as the tide of battle threatened to sweep them away. The sight of their king wounded rippled through the English line like a knife through cloth. Men faltered, their courage shaken, for the banner of Wessex now wavered with the man who bore its honor. The shield wall, once ironclad, began to splinter under the weight of despair. For William and his men, the moment was decisive. Trumpets blared, and the Normans surged forward with renewed fury. The fall of Harold was not just the loss of a leader but the breaking of the heart of England's resistance. Though legends differ on how he died, whether by arrow or blade, the truth remains that Harold's fall marked the turning point of Hastings. In that instant, England's fate shifted forever, and the crown slipped from Saxon hands. The death of a king, the death of Harold was not swift. Surrounded by his loyal Huscarls he fought even as the arrow blinded him. When Norman knights broke through, they cut him down in a brutal melee, hacking at the king until he no longer stirred. His body, once regal, was left mutilated on the ground, nearly unrecognizable to those who found him. For his men, the sight was unbearable. Huscarls fought to the last breath, refusing to surrender their king's body to the enemy. One by one they fell, their axes dripping with blood until none remained standing. Their sacrifice turned the patch of ground around Harold into a shrine of loyalty, marked forever by their final stand. The English line collapsed without its leader. Men broke ranks and fled, their courage shattered with the death of their king. The Golden Dragon banner fell into the mud, trampled underfoot, as Norman soldiers pressed their advantage. The hill that had stood as a fortress became a slaughterhouse. William's men celebrated, but even they recognized the magnitude of what had occurred. They had not merely slain a king, they had ended a dynasty. The age of Anglo-Saxon rule had died with Harold on Senlac Hill. The battlefield grew quiet as night approached, but the silence was heavy with the knowledge that England itself had been remade in blood. Harold's body, broken and stripped of glory, lay as the final witness to the end of an era. The Norman victory, with Harold slain and the English fleeing. Victory belonged to William. His army, battered yet unbroken, claimed the hill that had resisted them for so long. Trumpets rang out, and shouts of triumph echoed across the field, declaring the birth of a new ruler. William, bloodied but alive, stood upon the battlefield as conqueror. The cost had been immense. Norman dead lay strewn among the English, their armor dented, their banners torn. Yet the victory justified the sacrifice. William had risked everything on the gamble of invasion, and now the crown of England lay within his grasp. The surviving English retreated in disarray, their spirit broken. Some fled into the forests, others back to their villages, but none could deny that their kingdom had fallen. The Huscarls who had once guarded the king lay silent, their loyalty paid in blood. William wasted no time in securing his claim. Scouts rode across the countryside, spreading word of his triumph and quelling any thoughts of resistance. His rule would not begin with hesitation, but with decisive authority, forged in the crucible of Hastings. Thus, the Battle of Hastings became more than a victory. It was the moment England changed hands. The day the Norman conquest began. The old order had ended, and a new one was written in the language of swords. The end of an era. The death of Harold and the victory of William marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon age. For centuries, England had been shaped by its kings, earls, and warriors, but all of that was swept away in a single day of battle. The Norman conquest was not merely a change of ruler, it was the rewriting of a nation's identity. With William's coronation soon to follow, the structures of power began to shift. Norman lords replaced Saxon nobles, castles rose where villages once stood, and French became the language of the court. What had been familiar to the English people faded quickly into memory, leaving only fragments of the old ways. Yet the memory of resistance did not vanish. Tales of Harold's courage and the Huscarls' loyalty lingered, whispered by those who mourned the loss of their kingdom. In those stories, England's past lived on, even as its future was reshaped by foreign hands. The lone Viking at Stamford Bridge, Harold's march across England, and the shield wall at Hastings became threads in a tapestry of defiance. They reminded the people that, though conquered, they had fought with honor until the very end. The end of the era was not merely a loss, but also the birth of legend. From the blood of Hastings rose stories that would echo through centuries, shaping how England remembered itself long after the swords had grown silent. The flight of the English. When the shield wall finally collapsed, chaos spread like fire through the English ranks. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder now scattered, casting aside shields and weapons in a desperate bid for survival. The once orderly line dissolved into a tide of panic, pouring down the hill as Norman cavalry pressed hard upon their heels. The pursuit was merciless. Norman knights cut down fleeing soldiers without hesitation, trampling them beneath hooves or striking with lances as they tried to escape. The English countryside became a hunting ground, its fields soaked with the blood of men who had fought bravely only hours before. Some managed to vanish into the woods and marshes, slipping away into the darkness where horses could not follow. These survivors carried with them stories of the battle, tales of courage and loss that would spread across England in the days to come. Yet their escape was bittersweet, for they fled not as soldiers but as men without a king. On the hill itself, the Normans claimed victory. The banners of William replaced those of Harold, fluttering proudly in the evening wind. The hill that had been a fortress of Saxon defiance now belonged to the conquerors. The flight of the English was not merely the retreat of an army, but the collapse of a kingdom. With Harold dead and his forces scattered, there remained no strength capable of resisting William's rise. England had been broken in a single day, searching for Harold. After the battle, William ordered the field to be searched for the fallen king. Among the thousands of corpses that littered the slope, Harold's body had to be found. Yet when his men uncovered it, they discovered a figure so mangled by blade and arrow that even his closest companions could scarcely recognize him. Tradition holds that Edith, the fair, Harold's beloved, was brought to identify him. Where soldiers and lords failed, she alone could know him by sight, by scars, or by the features only she remembered. The tale of her recognition adds a human sorrow to the grim aftermath. A moment of mourning amid the triumph of conquest. William, though victorious, showed no reverence for the fallen king. Accounts differ on what became of Harold's body. Some say it was buried without honor upon the seashore. Others that it was given to the church at Waltham Abbey. Whatever the truth, no monument marked his grave with certainty, and his resting place became a mystery of history. For the English, the uncertainty was a wound that never healed. To lose a king in battle was one thing, but to see his body denied the dignity of remembrance was another. It symbolized the erasure of their old order, a deliberate act of dominance by their conqueror. The search for Harold's remains became not just a task of identification, but the first act of rewriting history. In denying him a clear burial, William ensured that, even in death, Harold's memory would remain unsettled. William the Conqueror. With his enemies slain and the field secured, William's title changed forever. No longer was he merely the Duke of Normandy. He was William the Conqueror. His gamble, a dangerous crossing of the Channel and a battle fought on foreign soil, had won him a crown. Yet victory was only the beginning. Claiming England required more than defeating Harold's army. He had to convince a conquered people to accept his rule, to bend their loyalty to a man they called a foreigner. The task demanded not only strength but also cunning. William immediately sought to secure the countryside, sending forces to subdue towns and castles before rebellion could rise. Villages that resisted faced the sword, while those that submitted were spared, though never truly free. The message was clear. Obedience brought survival, defiance brought ruin. The Normans began to build their mark upon England. Castles rose upon hills and river crossings, stark symbols of domination that reminded every Englishman who now ruled the land. These stone towers were not merely fortresses but declarations of permanence. William's conquest was more than a victory of arms. It was the foundation of a dynasty. From the ashes of Hastings, a New England was being forged, one that bore the mark of Normandy in every law, castle, and tongue. The changing of England. The Conquest set in motion, a transformation that touched every corner of English life. Norman lords replaced Saxon nobles, taking lands as rewards for loyalty to William. Families who had held estates for generations were stripped of their heritage, forced into servitude under foreign masters. The language of power shifted as well. French became the tongue of the court, the law, and the church, while the Old English language survived only in the villages and among common folk. Over time, the two tongues blended, giving birth to the language that would one day be known as English. The church, too, came under Norman influence. Bishops and abbots loyal to William were installed, ensuring that even the sacred voice of religion spoke in favor of his rule. Cathedrals rose in the new style, vast and towering, casting shadows across towns that once knew only wooden chapels. The very landscape changed. Forests were claimed as royal hunting grounds, villages were taxed under new systems, and castles dominated the skyline where once only farmsteads stood. For the common people, life became harsher, their labor feeding a ruling class that spoke a foreign tongue. Yet out of this upheaval emerged a New England, shaped by both Saxon endurance and Norman innovation. The old and the new collided, creating a society unlike either of its parents, forged in the crucible of conquest. The legacy of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings did not end with the fall of Harold. Its echoes carried through centuries. It was the day that altered the destiny of England, setting it upon a course that would define its language, culture, and monarchy for generations. For the Normans, it was a triumph that proved the might of their duke and cemented their place in history. For the English, it was a day of sorrow, remembered as the loss of freedom, the end of the line of Saxon kings. Yet even in defeat, the memory of resistance endured, shaping legends that would never fade. Chroniclers on both sides preserved the story, each framing it to honor their cause. The Normans celebrated divine favor, while the English mourned the bravery of men who fought until the last. Between these two narratives, the truth of Hastings lived on, neither fully conquered nor forgotten. The tapestry of the battle was woven not only in cloth but in memory, stitched into the very fabric of English identity. Every arrow, every shield, every fallen warrior became part of a legend greater than the battle itself. The legacy of Hastings is more than the story of a king's fall. It is the moment where one world ended and another began, a turning point that shaped not only medieval England but the nation that would rise from its ashes. The survivors' stories. Though the battlefield was lost, the voices of the survivors carried the tale far beyond Hastings. Wounded huscarls crawled away under cover of night, their shields splintered, their axes broken, yet their memories intact. They whispered of Harold's courage, of the shield wall's defiance, and of the chaos that ended it all. Villagers along the coast heard their accounts and spread them from hearth to hearth. Some said Harold had been struck by an arrow, others swore he was cut down by Norman swords. The truth blurred into legend as each tale was retold, shaped by grief and pride. These stories mattered, in an age where few could write. Memory and voice preserved history. What the survivors spoke became the foundation of England's collective memory, a testimony to bravery even in defeat. For the English, it was a way of resisting erasure. Though their king was gone and their land subdued, their words ensured that Hastings would be remembered not as a simple conquest, but as a saga of heroism and loss. Thus, even the defeated shaped history, their voices echoing across generations, long after the clash of swords had ceased. The Bayeux Tapestry. Among the most enduring records of the conquest is the Bayeux Tapestry, a vast embroidery that tells the story of Hastings in thread and color. Stretched across nearly 70 meters, it depicts the march of William's army, the crowning of Harold, and the climactic battle that decided England's fate. Every figure, from armored knights to humble archers, is stitched with precision. Horses gallop, ships sail, and warriors clash, frozen in time by the hands of artisans. Above and below, strange creatures and symbols weave their own silent commentary, part history, part art. The tapestry is more than a record, it is propaganda. Commissioned by Norman patrons, it frames the conquest as divinely ordained, presenting William as rightful heir and Harold as oathbreaker. Yet in its images, we also see glimpses of the chaos and courage that neither side could deny. For centuries, the tapestry has preserved the memory of Hastings more vividly than any chronicle. It is both artifact and storyteller, carrying across the ages the vision of a world forever changed on that October day. And though its threads may fade, the narrative they hold continues to shape our understanding of one of history's greatest turning points. The rise of Norman England in the years that followed. William reshaped England into a realm unlike any before it. Norman castles dotted the landscape, their stone walls imposing order where once wooden halls had stood. Each fortress was both a weapon and a warning, a constant reminder of who held power. Lands were redistributed to Norman lords, stripping the old Saxon elite of their holdings. Families who once ruled villages and shires found themselves dispossessed, their wealth and status handed to newcomers who owed loyalty only to William. Law and governance shifted as well. Feudal obligations bound men to lords, and lords to the king, creating a web of authority centered on the crown. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, catalogued every field, house, and tenant, transforming England into one of the most administratively controlled kingdoms of its time. Though harsh, these changes created stability. Norman order replaced Saxon independence, forging a kingdom more unified, if less free. The seeds of a centralized monarchy were planted, seeds that would grow into the England of future centuries. The conquest was not merely about who wore the crown, it redefined the very structure of English society, leaving a legacy that stretched far beyond the battlefield. Memory and myth. Over time, Hastings ceased to be just a battle and became a myth. Chroniclers wove it into a moral tale, a lesson in loyalty, ambition, and fate. Harold's fall was painted as punishment for breaking an oath, while William's victory was framed as God's will. Yet among the common people, a different memory endured. They remembered Harold not as an oath-breaker, but as a king who stood with his men to the very end. The image of the arrow in his eye became legend, a symbol of tragic defiance, rather than divine judgment. Each retelling reshaped the event, layering history with symbolism. For the Normans, it justified their rule. For the English, it became a story of loss and resilience. Myth and memory blended, creating a narrative that spoke to more than facts. It spoke to identity. And so Hastings lived on, not only in chronicles and tapestries but in the imagination of generations. The battle's truth mattered less than its meaning, and its meaning echoed across centuries of English history. In this way, Hastings was never truly over, it became part of the soul of a nation. The turning of an age. The Battle of Hastings marked the end of one age and the dawn of another. The line of Saxon kings was broken, their traditions swept aside by the tide of Norman rule. England itself stood at a crossroads, its destiny forever altered by a single day of blood and steel. Yet endings are also beginnings. Out of conquest grew a New England, shaped by both its conquerors and its conquered. Norman strength fused with Saxon resilience, creating a kingdom that would one day rise to shape the world. The men who fought at Hastings could not have known the weight of their struggle. To them, it was a battle for crown and country, for land and loyalty. To history, it was the hinge upon which a nation turned. The fields of Sussex, once soaked with blood, became silent again. Grass grew where warriors had fallen, and time softened the scars of war. But the memory remained, carried forward in story, stone, and spirit. Hastings was more than a battle. It was a transformation, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, a reminder that in the clash of swords, the fate of nations can be rewritten in a single day. As the dust settles over the fields of Hastings, and the echoes of battle fade into history, we are left with more than a story of kings and warriors. We are left with a saga of courage, of loyalty, of a world transformed by the choices of a few. From the lone Viking at Stamford Bridge to the fall of Harold Godwinson, history is shaped not just by armies, but by the human will to fight, to survive, and to leave a legacy. If this journey through the Viking stands, the marches of kings, and the clash of armies captivated you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell to never miss a deep dive into the most extraordinary and bizarre moments history has ever witnessed. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think truly shaped England's fate that year? The lone Viking at Stamford Bridge, or King Harold at Hastings? And if you want more epic tales of warriors, battles, and legends, check out our other videos, each one a voyage into the forgotten corners of history. Because history is not just in books. It's alive, it's brutal, and it's waiting for you.